Alison. Thank you for the organisers. It's lovely to be here, but also amongst louder people who've been very influential in my career, Alice Medalia and Till Weeks, in order of introduction in relation to cognitive remediation. Till was in the Institute when John and I were there in the 1990s. But also I'd like to acknowledge those in the audience who have reached out to me to support the implementation of cognitive remediation in their areas, and in particular those at Orange. It's a very small input that I make, a really great follow through by those staff. Also the staff at Concord. Sarah sort of has got, I get energy envy when I'm around her, and she's a great force for change. Also acknowledge Anne Miles with Wise Minds in Melbourne. Now, I've done a bit of a slightly provocative alteration in the title here, and it really is to draw attention to a point that has been made, is that we can't deliver cognitive remediation to everyone, despite how common neurocognitive, and social cognitive deficits are in people, particularly with a diagnosis of psychosis. And in fact, the deficits vary in any individual, so it may not be the most appropriate form of care to deliver either. And it's not sufficient for recovery. And let's see if I can. And again, I'm just drawing your attention to how I view recovery. And obviously, in terms of clinical and functional remission, as a clinician, that's where my main work occurs, but acknowledge the experiential and subjective personal journey that people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia or psychosis go on. And my role there is very much to facilitate that recovery and hopefully offer some interventions that they might seek out and feel may be of use to them in that very personal journey. The other thing, not to minimise the role of mental health services, but in regards to Tony and other people here from the NGO sector, we're a small part, not insignificant, but a small part in the broader services that are required in anybody's journey to recovery. So just a few points that I wanted to make, both about the heterogeneity of cognitive deficits in schizophrenia and also about recovery. And I'm very much talking about functional recovery. The other issue in recovery is that a number of interventions are required for people on a recovery journey who have disabilities from their illness. And cognitive interventions are very much a part of this mix. And quoting from Till and Matteo Cella, these cognitive problems can impede recovery. And also with those interventions like CBT, which I've also been part of delivering CBT for psychosis, it's these basic cognitive impairments that can impair people's ability to benefit from CBT. A lovely study done, the NICE guidelines recommend everybody have a course of CBT because not everybody can get that. And so a lovely study done in Manchester showed that recruited from the wait list of people getting CBT, and showed in fact if they had cognitive remediation, they required less CBT, less courses. So more efficient use of these therapies that require and assume competence in higher cognitive functioning. Okay, the other point I'd like to draw your attention to, and again, perhaps highlighted from the previous speakers, is the difference between capacity and performance. So we've all got the capacity to eat a healthy diet, and how many of you had the lamingtons? You know, okay, I'm not shaming you here, but you know, so our performance doesn't always match our capacity, and a number of the measures, outcome measures measuring function, focus on functional capacity rather than real-world functioning, and this is an issue obviously for OTs. And obviously the issue of motivation, seeing a challenge and whether you interact with the challenge is dependent on your self-efficacy, self-confidence. And also from the neuroscience of motivation, we know a lot of people with psychosis measure effort and challenge in a different way from you and I, see things far more daunting way than they need necessarily to be. Okay, then the models of real-world functioning, again, trying to keep cognitive remediation and social cognition interventions, the interventions that were the basis of my PhD, into perspective. And this is one model of 3 that are published in this article. The first model of improving neurocognition is the linear model that Alice referred to, that we just improve neurocognition and real-world functioning will follow. There's obviously still also the mediating models where you look at improving neurocognition and maybe social cognition needs to occur before you get improved social real-world functioning. But in reality, it's quite complex, and I think Alice drew attention that different people might go on different pathways, and different pathways may be important. And this is why we find that these interventions, these skill-based interventions, tend to be more effective in a total integrated recovery and rehabilitation services. Okay. The other point that has been made that I'll just elaborate further on, but it's been one of the issues that is particularly vexing for us, and obviously for our early psychosis colleagues, is that these deficits of neurocognitive impairment and social cognitive impairment predate the onset of diagnosed illness. And that's important because that's where the initial entry into care occurs. And so people are entering into care often with mental health service care in particular at a time when they've got high positive symptom burden, they've had an acute psychotic episode, as well as having a burden in terms of their functional impairment that has predated their diagnosed illness. And it depends on whether you're a cup half full, cup half empty person. What we do know about social cognitive deficits and neurocognitive deficits is unlike other aspects of the illness, in particular positive symptoms, they tend to be more stable for most of your adult life, at least post the psychotic episode. Chris will pick me up if I don't acknowledge that there is some changes in the transition period. So this is an opportunity, I think, but an opportunity that's going missing because we haven't got the service systems that or the staff that are skilled to deliver these treatments. I'm so pleased I'm going to acknowledge both Till and Alice have been so influential in my career. And I'm going to ask Alice to bear with me. I've actually doctored this quote, and the bits in brackets are the ones that I've added. So what I like about this quote, it rings true to us as clinicians, those of us who are clinicians or who are delivering care to individuals with psychosis, And that is the repeated experiences of failure in learning and social situations during adolescence can result in a disengaged attitude to learning and cognitive and social activity. And this is the interest about defeatist attitudes that contributes in the Recht, Grant and Beck model of negative symptoms to negative symptoms and disengagement, social amotivation, and poor functional outcome. Okay. I'm going to slow down because I think I've been talking too quickly. And also what was brought up about is early auditory processing. I think Alice mentioned this, and this is just an example of where we think some of this early information processing can impact on function down the line. Here it's early visual perception, and we're using social cognition, but you could enter here auditory perception and neurocognition. And these deficits in information processing that impact on basic social and cognitive processing leads to interactions with socially and in terms of cognitive activities that can result in defeatist attitudes and lead to experiential negative symptoms. In negative symptoms, we mean that social amotivation that Till was talking about and poor functional outcomes. So a lot of these articles on cognitive remediation start with really fun titles like cognitive remediation, it's getting more complex, or cognitive remediation, it's getting more personal. It is definitely getting more complex, and it does need to be quite personal. So how do we address them? And I'm a big C clinician and a little R researcher. My identity is very much about a clinician who's spent over 30 years managing primarily people with psychosis. So that's where I feel comfortable. And so I'm very interested in practical things in real world services that we can do. What we can do is learn and teach our people who come into our services with these cognitive deficits how to compensate and adapt for these cognitive problems to minimize the impact of the problem. We can also look at intensive skills-based programs like cognitive remediation to restore cognitive functioning. In reality, like our previous speakers have spoken about, most programs that are effective cognitive remediation programs will do both skills-based intervention and aspects of compensation and adaptation. And all the while leveraging the personal environmental resources, because I think it was Till who pointed out that there's a huge variance that's not accounted for by cognitive deficits, a huge variance in functional outcome that's not accounted for by those deficits. So if we isolate these treatments from where they live, where they have to apply the skills, they're not going to be effective. So in looking at the evidence base in cognitive remediation, there tends to be this, it depends on what you're needing the evidence for. I collared Till some years ago and said, is the evidence good enough to begin to implement cognitive remediation in real world services? And she said yes, so I hold her personally responsible for, but no, in reality, the evidence is good enough, but picking up on Alice's comments, we need the services, we need routine mental health services delivering interventions to target cognitive deficits and then iteratively improving them based on the information both in a local context, what works for our population, and also based on the evidence coming from research settings. We do need more research on mechanisms of effect. That's unlikely to come from clinical researchers, but if we partner well, we're currently undertaking a cognitive, a randomized controlled trial of CogSmart, a pen and paper-based intervention for cognitive deficits and circuits. We hope to be finished this year. And we've partnered with Marta Gardo, who's now at the University of Melbourne, and particularly looking at mismatch negativity that has got a lot of attention in the past as a potential biomarker of young people going on to psychosis, but we're using it as a potential marker of benefit. Again, trying to work out how do we pick of all the people with cognitive deficits, who's going to benefit from these programs. So we do need more research on mechanisms of effect, and we will be calling on our research institutions to do that. But we need to be making sure that on the ground, mental health services have got a way of triaging this information and adapting their programs quickly and efficiently. We need more research on adjuncts. In a paper recently published by Till and others, they did note that the most evidence is on psychosocial interventions as adjuncts to cognitive remediation. And in particular, these are rehabilitation services. I'm also interested by an article, small article by Elizabeth Twomley and colleagues, where they looked at some dopamine enhancers just half an hour before doing cognitive remediation, trying to prime the reward learning pathway to improve learning in these skills-based interventions, but using that not as an ongoing medication, but in a very targeted way to target that reward learning pathway. Okay. Now, this is again a diagram from Till and Matteo Cella, Till's group. And this is from an article saying cognitive remediation in schizophrenia, now it's getting really personal. But I think this diagram, what they're making the argument for, and Till can correct me if I've got this wrong, is that we need to be integrating various sources of information that will lead to improving these interventions. Currently, cognitive remediation will look at the behavioural symptoms like the disorganisation. We can look at composite behavioural phenotypes like with the neurocognitive tests, for example, executive functioning. We can look at reward sensitivity, particularly in the way we deliver interventions and targeting motivation. But also we need to be looking at potential augmentation strategies like I was talking about in biological and neurobiological systems, while still accounting for personalisation. What's the person's illness experience? Yes, they've got cognitive impairment. Is that what they need and want at this point in their recovery journey? But I think we need these sort of translational frameworks. Melissa Green, wherever you are, Melissa, is very keen on this idea, again, trying to bring neuroscience into the interventions we deliver, even at a clinical interface. But at the coalface, what can we do? And I know most of us are at the coalface trying to deliver interventions. Probably my particular interest is building up a skilled workforce. I want our workforce to be as confident and comfortable with cognitive impairment of psychosis as they are with delusions and hallucinations. We need all staff having a fundamental knowledge of the cognitive impairment of psychosis. We need novice skilled practitioners to deliver some of these intensive skills-based therapies like cognitive remediation. And then we need experts who can act as the triage being aware of the information coming from research settings, but also looking at iterative improvements that are needed to be made for the local context. And in implementation science, they talk about knowing the core components of an intervention, and then you can make fits as long as you're adherent to those core components, like what we've heard, a therapist involved, a certain intensity of delivering cognitive remediation. Then you can make adaptations for the various sites. And I'm particularly interested in this, not only in regional centres like in Orange, but also I'm doing some work with Chennai in translating CogSmart into Tamil, again with Elizabeth Tormley, who developed CogSmart. And obviously they're a low-resourced area that won't be able to afford online programs necessarily. And so we need to know what is the core components of cognitive remediation that can be delivered in various settings, and what adjustments can we make. So from where I stand, and unfortunately I'm not able to influence services as much as I have been able to in Metro South, but we do need services running an evaluating program to address cognitive impairment with high fidelity to the core components as we currently know them, and iterative improvements based on local context and also the research coming out of our tertiary sectors. Thank you.